The whistle blew across the frozen field like the cry of a dying bird, echoing off the wooden barracks and the coiled wire that surrounded them. Frost hung in the air as British and Commonwealth prisoners kicked a ragged leather football across the mud of Stalag Luft III, their boots slipping, laughter cutting through the morning cold. The guards on the watchtowers leaned on their rifles, half amused, half bored. Another morning, another game. The prisoners' strange obsession with pretending they were free. From the outside, it looked harmless. The Luftwaffe officers even encouraged it, believing the sport kept the men docile, kept their minds off escape. But they didn't see what was beneath the field. Just inches below the churned mud, behind the rumble of boots and shouts of, "Pass it, lad!" there was movement. A muffled scrape, a grunt, a breath held too long. The ground trembled not from the game, but from the men digging under it. The ball soared, the crowd roared, and under the shadow of that cheer, a handful of mud-streaked hands passed a bucket of sand through a tunnel no wider than a coffin. From the touchline, Flight Lieutenant Tom Barrett, his face caked with frost and dirt, raised his arm, calling out plays in a commander disguised as a footballer. His eyes flicked toward the barracks, counting seconds, breaths, movements. The guards thought he was barking strategy. In truth, he was signaling the diggers below, all clear. Each kick, each foul, each throw-in was coded. To the Germans, it was just a game. To the prisoners, it was war. A whistle meant pause the dig. A goal meant pull back the bucket. A missed shot meant danger, and every time the football hit the wire fence and rolled back, it carried more than dirt. It carried hope wrapped in mud and sweat. As the match reached its fever, the crowd of prisoners, men from England, Canada, Australia, Poland, and shouted and stamped, the noise masking the faint crack of a wooden brace breaking underground. One of the diggers froze, the earth pressing against his helmet, the air thick and sour. Above him, his best friend kicked the ball high into the air, shouting for a foul, drawing every guard's eye toward the commotion. Below, the man exhaled and kept digging. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, as the ball hit the ground and the crowd erupted in laughter, the diggers broke through the last layer of soil, and a cold rush of air flooded in. The tunnel had reached the perimeter. No one above knew. Not yet. The game ended with cheers, handshakes, and a thin veneer of normality. The guards clapped mockingly, one even shouting, "Engländer gut spielen." The men smiled, nodding, their hands still trembling from the adrenaline. As they walked back to the barracks, their boots dragging, the ball rolled to a stop beside the wire. Its leather cracked, its seams filled with mud. Inside that ball, sewn into the lining by steady hands under candlelight, was a tiny compass, a map, and a folded piece of paper that simply read, "Tomorrow." The morning began with a silence that felt too heavy for winter, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ribs like a held breath. Frost glazed every inch of Stalag Luft III, the infamous Luftwaffe-run POW camp near Sagan, where over 10,000 captured airmen from Britain, Canada, Australia, and the United States waited out the war behind walls of wire and watchtowers. Inside those fences, routine had become religion. Roll call at dawn, weak coffee, mending boots, and then, if the guards permitted, a game of football on the cleared patch between the barracks. The Germans thought it harmless, even clever. Give the prisoners something to burn their energy on so they'd stop plotting escapes. But beneath the surface of that brittle calm, something vast and dangerous was in motion. It was January 1944, and while the world beyond the wire was frozen in stalemate, within this patch of frozen earth, a plan was breathing. The football pitch, a patch of dirt and ice surrounded by guard towers, had become both a stage and a disguise. Every pass, every slip, every cheer concealing the rhythm of a secret that would soon hum beneath the boots of both prisoners and guards alike. It had begun months earlier, when Flight Lieutenant Tom Barrett, a downed RAF navigator shot out of his Lancaster over the Ruhr, first noticed how often the guards' attention drifted during the football matches. They leaned on their rifles, joked, and smoked, never imagining that the field itself, the very heart of their camp, could betray them. Barrett, who had studied engineering before the war, saw potential in the unremarkable, the soft patch of soil at the southern end, the slope where runoff drained beneath the perimeter fence, the way the ball always disappeared into the reeds before rolling back. Beneath that patch, he knew, was the only way out. Over weeks of observation, he built a plan, one that would require precision, nerve, and a deception so perfect it would unfold in plain sight. He gathered a handful of men: Corporal Peter Pip Evans, a Welsh miner with arms like iron; Sergeant John Harker, a wiry Englishman with a voice like sandpaper; and Flying Officer Sam Grant, a wiry Australian who could charm a guard out of his rations with a grin. They called themselves the Ground Crew, a dark joke among flyers who no longer had planes. Their mission: to dig beneath the field, build a tunnel that led beyond the wire, and hide the entire operation beneath the daily chaos of football. The first dig began on a night when the moon was hidden by clouds. They worked from inside the barracks stove pit, a narrow crawl space masked by soot and heat. The moment the guards' boots faded down the corridor, Evans pried up the loose boards and Harker slid into the blackness with a tin plate for a shovel. The air was cold and thick with dirt. They dug by touch, passing handfuls of soil back into buckets made from food tins, whispering each time one filled. The tunnel had to run 30 feet before reaching the pitch, and every inch risked discovery. Barrett organized shifts, mapping each movement with the precision of an air raid plan. Above ground, Grant's job was to keep the guards distracted, teaching them football chants, joking, offering cigarettes rolled from Red Cross tobacco. The guards liked him. They called him Der verrückte Australier. Beneath their laughter, the earth groaned quietly, reshaping itself with every inch the men stole from it. Within weeks, the tunnel had grown to 15 feet, supported by makeshift timber braces carved from bed slats. The men used stolen wire from broken bunks for ventilation, tin from powdered milk cans to shore up the walls, and the canvas of old RAF maps to line the floor against the seeping frost. The challenge wasn't just digging, and it was hiding the evidence. Every ounce of dirt had to vanish without trace. During football matches, while the guards watched the players, others would empty small bags of sand into the field, scattering it beneath their boots, blending it with the churned mud until no one could tell new from old. The guards saw only a muddy pitch. They never saw the ground itself rising by a hair each day. Barrett's team rehearsed their signals as if they were combat maneuvers. A whistle blow during a match meant the tunnelers had to freeze. Every sound below could be amplified through the frozen ground. A second whistle meant clear. A goal celebrated with deliberate chaos masked the thud of shifting earth as supports were replaced or buckets passed back. Even the football itself played its part. The men had hollowed out its core and packed it with rolled blueprints, a small compass, and later, messages for coordination. When the ball was kicked near the southern fence, a retriever, usually Harker, would chase it down, crouch to retrieve it, and subtly check the soil above the tunnel's mouth for any sign of collapse. The game was no longer a pastime. It was camouflage, choreography, and defiance disguised as play. But the risk was always there, coiled in every heartbeat. The Germans were not fools. Hauptmann Friedrich Keller, the camp commandant, had already executed men for less. He believed himself a humane officer, but his patience with escape attempts was gone after the Great Escape rumors began circulating. The prisoners knew this. One misstep, one stray word, one collapsed tunnel could mean all their deaths. Yet the need for freedom burned hotter than fear. In the barracks at night, Barrett would study the tunnel diagram drawn on the back of a chessboard, tracing it with his finger while outside, the searchlights swept the snow. "We're not digging through earth," Evans once said quietly. "We're digging through time." And it felt true. Every scoop of dirt brought them closer not to the fence but to the idea of life after it. Weeks turned into months. The tunnel snaked under the pitch, its progress marked in secret tally marks carved into the stove's inner wall. They reinforced it with stolen wood from the camp workshop, smuggling pieces out one at a time under blankets or inside hollowed Red Cross boxes. When frost made the soil brittle, they burned scraps of paper underground for warmth, risking suffocation just to keep the walls from freezing solid. The sound of boots above, footballers running, shouting, laughing, became their rhythm, their clock, their heartbeat. By late February, they had dug 31 feet, breaking through the last section just beneath the fence line. The air that rushed in was so cold it felt like freedom itself. They were ready. On the morning of February 22, 1944, the soccer match that would decide everything began like all the others. The guards watched lazily, rifles slung. Barrett took the opening kick. Beneath his feet, Evans and Harker lay in the dark, lanterns dimmed, waiting for the signal. The ball flew across the field and the game began. a storm of motion, noise, and perfect deception. The guards shouted bets to one another. Laughter echoed off the barracks. No one saw the trapdoor hidden under the field, disguised with mud and a patch of grass. Beneath it, in the cold dirt, two men crawled toward the wire. Above them, their comrades shouted, cheered, and clashed like warriors of sport. The tunnel vibrated with the sound. Barrett's eyes met Grant's across the field. The signal passed wordlessly. The ball soared, the crowd roared, and underground, hands broke through to open air. That night, while the guards slept and the searchlights swept their endless circles, 4 men crawled through that tunnel, dragging their breath like anchors, their fingernails split from the frozen dirt. Behind them, in the barracks, the rest of the team waited for the all-clear. A single coded phrase to be whispered the next morning. We won the match. The night was black as coal dust, the moon swallowed by cloud. The only light, the distant glimmer of the camp's searchlights sweeping across the snow like slow, restless ghosts. Inside Barracks 104, the air was thick with tension and frost. The men packed shoulder to shoulder around the stove, their faces ghost pale in the candlelight. The football match earlier that day had gone exactly as planned. The signals flawless, the timing perfect, the guards none the wiser. Now the ground beneath their boots hummed with the life of what they had built. Beneath them, no more than 3 feet below the barracks floor, Flight Lieutenant Tom Barrett's men were preparing for what would be the most dangerous crawl of their lives. The tunnel, christened the pitch by the diggers, ran a full 38 feet from the stove pit under the soccer field to a shallow rise beyond the fence line, reinforced with bed slats and lined with stolen tin sheets. Its mouth, hidden under a false panel of earth just past the goalpost, had been tested twice and held firm. The plan was set. 4 men would go first, each carrying forged papers, maps, and small compasses sewn into their coats. If they reached the woods unseen, they'd signal by flashlight. 3 short flashes, then 2 long, meaning the way was clear for the next group. Above, the camp slept. Below, freedom waited in the cold earth. Barrett crouched at the entrance, his breath fogging the air as he whispered to Corporal Peter, Pip Evans, and Sergeant John Harker, the first 2 to crawl. Keep your pace. Don't rush. The supports will hold if you stay low. Evans nodded, his miner's hands trembling as he gripped the lantern. Harker, always the joker, grinned faintly. If it caves in, sir, tell my wife I went down fighting a bloody mole. Barrett smiled, though his throat ached. She already knows. Then they were gone, sliding into the tunnel like ghosts, their boots scraping softly against the earth. Behind them, Flying Officer Sam Grant sealed the entrance, masking the opening with a wooden brace and a thin layer of dirt. The candle above flickered once and went out. Silence. Then came the sound, faint at first, then rising. The muffled rhythm of movement, of hands and knees pushing through the soil. The ground breathed. Above them, in the brittle air of the camp, a different world existed. The creak of barracks wood, the distant snore of men, the occasional crack of a guard's boot on frozen gravel. The searchlights arced in their endless rotations, their beams slicing through the mist. From the guard tower near the southern fence, Unteroffizier Klaus Reinhardt, a young conscript barely 21, leaned against his rifle, stamping his feet for warmth. He hated this post, this endless monotony of watching men he pitied but couldn't help. When the floodlight passed over the soccer field, he noticed nothing unusual, just churned snow, frozen mud, and the faint indentations of the earlier game. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Reinhardt exhaled, bored, and turned his gaze toward the barracks. He never saw the faint rise of soil just beyond the goalpost, the whisper of air escaping from beneath it. Inside the tunnel, the air grew thinner, the walls closing in. Evans led the crawl, his lamp flickering against the tin plates that lined the roof, each nailed in place with salvaged wire. Harker followed close behind, dragging a satchel of forged papers and food, chocolate, biscuits, a few tins of sardines. Sweat froze on their necks, their breath turning the dirt to paste. Every sound seemed deafening. The scrape of a boot, the crack of a brace, the beating of their own hearts. Halfway through, Evans felt the roof tremble. "Hold," he hissed. The 2 men froze, the lantern dimming. A groan rippled through the timber, followed by the dull crumble of falling earth. For one eternal second, it seemed the tunnel would collapse. Then silence again. Harker let out a shaky breath. "Bloody hell, Pip, remind me to never play football again." Evans chuckled softly. "When we're free, you can pick the field." They pushed on. At the barracks, Barrett knelt beside the hidden entrance, counting seconds. Every nerve in his body burned. He glanced at Grant, who sat at the table pretending to sketch, the stub of a pencil trembling in his hand. Outside, the sound of boots echoed, the night patrol passing by. The guards paused near the window, their flashlights sweeping the room. Barrett froze, forcing a smile as one guard peered in. "Alles gut, Engländer?" the man asked. "Alles gut," Barrett replied evenly, his German passable enough to mask the tremor in his voice. The guard grunted and moved on. The moment the footsteps faded, Barrett exhaled, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. Time crawled slower than the men below. When Evans and Harker finally reached the tunnel's end, they felt the air shift, colder, cleaner. Evans pressed his palm against the thin layer of soil above and felt the resistance break. A sliver of starlight pierced the darkness. They had reached the surface. Carefully, they pushed through, emerging behind a tangle of brush just beyond the wire. The cold air struck them like a blade. Harker looked back, the camp looming behind them. Watchtowers, lights, the vast geometry of captivity. "Christ," he whispered. "We did it." Evans didn't answer. He just pulled the small flashlight from his pocket, aimed it at the sky, and blinked the signal. 3 short, 2 long, inside the barracks. Barrett saw it through the window, a faint pulse of light beyond the fence like a heartbeat. His throat tightened. He turned to Grant. "They're clear." For a moment, the weight of every hour, every risk, every grain of dirt lifted. But then came the sound, the faint bark of a dog followed by a shout in German. Barrett's blood turned to ice. Outside, the searchlights snapped, sweeping toward the southern fence. The tunnelers were spotted. Harker and Evans dove for the trees as bullets tore through the snow. The camp erupted in chaos, alarms blaring, guards shouting, prisoners scrambling to their bunks. Barrett yanked the trapdoor open. "Back down," he hissed. Grant grabbed his sleeve. "They won't make it." Barrett's eyes were wild. "They have to." For 5 minutes, the night became a storm of motion. Searchlights slicing through the dark, machine guns rattling, dogs barking madly. Then, as suddenly as it began, the gunfire ceased. Silence fell over Stalag Luft III once more. The guards swept the field, their voices echoing, searching for footprints, for signs. They found none. Only the churned mud of the soccer pitch, the place where laughter and defiance had hidden a tunnel that now lay empty. Inside the barracks, Barrett sat with his head in his hands, dirt streaking his face, the adrenaline draining from his veins. He didn't know yet if Evans and Harker had made it, if they had reached the forest or been dragged back to the wire. All he knew was that the tunnel had worked. The ground had breathed, and for a moment so had freedom. Snow fell like ash over the forests of Lower Silesia, muffling the world into silence. The war, even out here, was never quiet. The distant rumble of artillery rolled like thunder from the west, yet inside the pines it was as though time itself held its breath. 2 shadows moved through the trees, bent low under the weight of exhaustion, their boots leaving only faint impressions in the powder. Corporal Peter "Pip" Evans and Sergeant John Harker were alive, though barely. Their lungs burned, their faces streaked with frost and grime, their hands raw from clawing through the tunnel's final feet. Behind them, the faint glow of Stalag Luft III was disappearing into the mist, a nightmare receding but never gone. They didn't dare speak. Every sound felt like betrayal, every broken twig a death sentence. They moved in rhythm with their breathing, step, pause, listen. Step, pause, listen. Above them, the sky was a bruise of gray and fading stars. Freedom, they knew, was still hundreds of miles away. They had planned for this. Barrett's meticulous maps, smuggled into camp by a sympathetic Red Cross driver, showed the nearest railway lines, the position of patrols, the route toward the Oder River. If they could reach Görlitz, there were Czech partisans rumored to operate in the area. Beyond that, neutral Switzerland lay like a dream at the edge of imagination. But for now, their world was trees, snow, and the constant threat of discovery. Evans carried the compass sewn into the football's leather, now wrapped in a handkerchief. Harker carried the rations, a few biscuits, 2 tins of sardines, a single chocolate bar. It had to last them until dawn. "We'll make it," Harker whispered finally, his voice ragged. Evans didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the faint glimmer of light that meant the road to Görlitz and with it danger. By morning, the cold had turned cruel. Their breath came in shallow gasps and frost crusted their lashes. They followed the tree line until they reached a narrow road cutting through the woods. Tracks and truck tires, boot prints impressed into the snow. Patrols, Evans murmured. They hid behind a fallen tree as two figures emerged from the fog. Volkssturm, local militia in mismatched uniforms, rifles slung carelessly. One of them was smoking, the ember glowing like a beacon in the gray light. The men laughed about something, voices thick with fatigue and vodka, then passed on. Only when the sound of their boots faded did Evans move. "We go east," he whispered. "If we hit the river, we follow it." Harker nodded, clutching the satchel tighter. Every direction was a risk. East at least meant the forest might hide them longer. They walked until their feet bled, stopping only when the pain became unbearable. Near a frozen creek, they found an abandoned hunting shack, half collapsed under the snow. Inside, they huddled beside a rusted stove, lighting a small flame from a single match. The warmth was almost painful. Harker pulled off his boots, staring at the blisters and frostbite spreading across his toes. "Remind me," he said hoarsely, "why we didn't stay in that lovely German hotel back there." Evans smiled faintly, his teeth chattering. "Didn't like the beds." The laughter that followed was short but real, a sound that cut through the cold like sunlight. For a few hours they rested. Evans scribbled notes in a small notebook, coordinates, bearings, bits of German he might need. "If we're caught," he said quietly, "we say we're displaced farmers. Refugees from Breslau," Harker snorted. "They'll shoot us anyway. Then at least we'll die pretending to be free." By the second night, hunger gnawed at their bellies. The rations were gone, the biscuits soaked through with melted snow. They ate bark from the birches, drank from the creek, and pressed on. Evans kept the compass close, his thumb tracing the metal like a talisman. "Southwest," he muttered over and over, as though the word itself could keep them alive. But the forest had eyes. Somewhere behind them, far off but growing closer, came the baying of dogs. The Germans had discovered the tunnel. Searchlights swept the camp, interrogations began, and the commando guards unleashed their hounds. By dawn, the forest echoed with the howls of the hunt. When the first shot cracked, it came from the north, echoing through the trees. Harker froze. "They've got our trail." Evans scanned the ground. Footprints, theirs, stretched clear as day across the snow. He cursed under his breath. "We'll head into the stream. The water'll hide us." They waded in, the ice biting into their legs like knives. The current was shallow but fast, carrying them half a mile downstream before they dared to climb out. Their clothes froze stiff almost instantly. "Christ, Pip," Harker gasped, teeth chattering. "We'll freeze before they catch us." Evans grinned, lips blue. "Then let's make it hard for them." They staggered onward, moving south now, deeper into the thickest part of the woods. Back at the camp, chaos ruled. Hauptmann Friedrich Keller paced the command office, slamming his fist against the table. "They dug under the field? Under the football pitch?" His adjutant nodded nervously. "Ja, Herr Hauptmann." "It appears so. The English used the games to cover the digging." Keller's face turned crimson. "I want those men alive. Do you understand, alive? I will not have another great escape on my record." Within an hour, Gestapo units were en route from Breslau, bringing with them interrogation squads and bloodhounds. Barrett and the remaining conspirators were separated from the general population, questioned under blinding lights. "Who escaped?" the interrogator demanded. Barrett stared back, eyes hollow. "It was a game," he said. "We played football." The interrogator slammed his fist against the table. "This is not a game." Barrett's voice was barely a whisper. "It was for us." In the forest, Evans and Harker were losing the race against time. By the third day, Harker's feet had swollen, each step agony. They took shelter in a barn near Kunzendorf, a small village half buried in snow. Through a crack in the wall, Evans watched farmers leading oxen through the fields, smoke rising from chimneys. For a moment, it almost looked like peace. They found a half-empty sack of potatoes, raw but edible. "Feast of Kings," Harker muttered, chewing slowly. Night fell heavy, bringing a new danger. Cold that seeped into bone and the low growl of dogs approaching. They could hear voices now. German commands shouted, the clang of metal on metal. "They're close," Evans whispered. They climbed into the hayloft, covering themselves with straw just as flashlights sliced through the cracks below. Two soldiers entered, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. One of them laughed. "Nothing here but rats," the other spat. Let's keep moving. Keller wants them before dawn. The door slammed shut. Evans didn't move for an hour. At dawn, they left the barn and followed a narrow road toward the mountains. Their goal was the Oder River, still 30 miles away. Every step felt like an eternity. By now, Harker was limping, his breath shallow. "You go," he said finally. "I'll slow you down." Evans stopped, gripping his arm. "You think I came all this way to walk alone?" Harker managed a weak grin. Sentimental bastard. They pushed forward together, leaning on each other for balance. The forest began to thin, revealing wide fields and in the distance the faint glimmer of water, the Oder. But between them and the river lay a small checkpoint. 2 soldiers, a radio, and a truck idling beside the road. Evans's mind raced. They couldn't cross the open ground unseen. Then he noticed something. A group of women carrying baskets, villagers heading toward the bridge. "If we mix in," he whispered, "we might pass." Harker nodded. They pulled their collars high, hiding their faces, and joined the small procession. The soldiers barely glanced at them, too busy arguing over the radio. For a moment it seemed they might succeed. Then one of the guards shouted, "Halt!" Evans froze. The soldier walked toward them, frowning. "Your papers." Evans handed over the forged documents, heart hammering. The guard studied them, his brow furrowing. "Farmers from Breslau?" he said skeptically. "You look too clean." Evans forced a smile. "We were lucky, Herr Soldat. The Russians bombed our village." The guard hesitated, then shrugged. "Move along." Relief flooded him. They crossed the bridge, the sound of the truck fading behind them. When night came, they reached the far side of the river and collapsed under the trees, too weak to go on. Harker's hands were shaking uncontrollably, his skin gray with exhaustion. "We did it," he whispered. "We're out." Evans nodded, but he knew better. The border was still days away, the forest crawling with patrols. He tore his scarf in half, wrapping Harker's feet. "Rest, I'll keep watch." The stars burned cold and bright above them. Somewhere to the west, artillery flared, painting the horizon red. The war raged on, indifferent to their escape. They were found 3 days later. A patrol of German soldiers stumbled upon their camp. 2 men half buried in snow, one barely conscious, the other too weak to stand. The officer in charge recognized their uniforms beneath the coats. "Prisoners," he said grimly. Evans and Harker were marched back toward the camp, their hands bound, the journey taking 2 brutal days. When they reached Stalag Luft III, Barrett was waiting in the yard, his face pale, eyes sunken. Harker gave a faint smile as they were shoved through the gate. "Told you we'd win the match," he said. Barrett said nothing, but his eyes burned. That night, Keller assembled the prisoners. "You are soldiers," he declared coldly, "but you are also liars and thieves. The Geneva Convention does not protect traitors." He paced before them, the searchlights casting long shadows across his face. "The next man who digs, who schemes, who hides, we will die." He turned to Evans and Harker. "You will spend 30 days in solitary confinement. If you survive, perhaps you'll learn what obedience means." But as the guards dragged them away, Barrett's eyes met Evans's, and in that brief exchange, the truth passed between them. The tunnel had worked. The Germans might have recaptured the men, but the camp's myth had changed. The prisoners now knew that escape was possible, that beneath the mud, under the eyes of every guard, defiance still breathed. That night, as snow drifted over the silent field where the football matches had once played, Barrett stood alone by the fence, staring at the dark outline of the tunnel's path. Somewhere beneath that frozen earth lay the trace of courage, the imprint of men who had risked everything for a glimpse of the sky beyond the wire. He knelt, pressing his hand to the soil. "Rest now," he whispered. "You gave them hope." And as dawn broke, the first light touched the camp, pale, fragile, but unbroken, the same way the spirit of the men within it refused to die. Spring arrived like a ghost at Stalag Luft III, pale and hesitant, the snow retreating from the edges of the barbed wire to reveal the churned, scarred field where so much had been risked. The prisoners, gaunt and hollow-eyed, shuffled through the routines of captivity. Roll calls, work details, the same thin soup at noon. But beneath that surface, something invisible was taking root. The story of the pitch, the tunnel that had hidden beneath their football field, had spread through the camp like wildfire. Even men who hadn't touched a shovel whispered about it in the barracks at night. How Evans and Harker had slipped beneath the wire, how they'd nearly reached the river, how they'd made the Germans panic. It wasn't failure they saw, it was proof. Proof that the guards could be fooled, that the ground itself could be an ally. For Flight Lieutenant Tom Barrett, still confined under suspicion and nursing bruised ribs from interrogation, that knowledge was everything. He could see it in the eyes of the men who came to him now, speaking in hushed tones during work details. They wanted to try again, not because they thought they could succeed, but because it reminded them they were still soldiers. Still men, still alive. The Germans, meanwhile, tried to crush the spirit before it could bloom. Hauptmann Friedrich Keller, humiliated before his superiors, ordered stricter discipline. Double roll calls, random searches, curfews enforced by rifle butts. The soccer field, once the heart of the prisoners' brief joys, was closed indefinitely. No games, Keller declared. No gatherings. You will have your recreation when Berlin says you may. Yet the irony was cruel. It was that very act of denial that hardened their resolve. The men didn't just miss football. They missed the rhythm of the game, the laughter that hid fear, the illusion of normalcy. It had been their rebellion disguised as sport, their code beneath the eyes of tyranny. So when Barrett was released from solitary confinement, thinner and weaker but unbroken, he found a small crowd waiting for him near the barracks stove. Among them stood Sam Grant, his once carefree grin now tempered by weeks of worry. "You heard what Keller said," Grant murmured. "No more matches." Barrett stared at the empty field through the window, the goalposts torn down, the mud frozen into scars. "Then we'll play anyway," he said softly. What followed wasn't just defiance, it was theater, sabotage, and silent warfare disguised as play. Over the weeks that followed, the prisoners began rebuilding the game in secret. They carved goalposts from scrap wood taken from broken bunks, stitched new balls from scavenged rags and wire, and cleared the field during work details, pretending to dig drainage trenches. The guards, though watchful, could not suppress everything. Even they knew that total stillness bred madness. Barrett exploited this. He approached Oberfeldwebel Richter, one of the older guards known for his leniency, and requested permission for light exercise to maintain morale. Richter hesitated but relented. 1 hour a week, he said, under watch. And so, under the cold eyes of the sentries, football returned to Stalag Luft III. But it was no longer just a game. Every pass, every cheer, every movement was charged with something dangerous, a silent language of defiance that made the guards nervous without knowing why. The first match was played under a thin sun, with men wearing patched uniforms and makeshift boots. The whistle blew, a sharp, fragile sound in the open air, and the field came alive. The guards leaned against their rifles, pretending indifference, but even they could sense the undercurrent. Barrett moved like a ghost across the pitch, his eyes scanning not the players, but the ground itself, the scars where the tunnel had once lain, the faint dips and rises that marked where the earth had been disturbed. Evans and Harker were gone, confined to solitary until they recovered, but their presence was everywhere. In the way, the men ran harder, laughed louder, refused to yield even when they fell. The match ended with no score, no victor, yet something unspoken had changed. For a moment, even the guards seemed caught by the illusion, men on both sides of the wire watching a game that neither could truly own. Barrett's leadership deepened. Each night he met with Grant and a small circle of trusted men, mechanics, engineers, and linguists, discussing plans not for escape this time, but for endurance. "They've taken the ground," he said quietly, "but they can't take what it stands for." The men began constructing miniature models of footballs from clay, using them as coded markers in a hidden map of the camp, tracing guard rotations and weak spots. They used the camp's choir practice to mask the sound of hammering, and chess matches to exchange information. Each activity, harmless on the surface, was a layer of resistance. Barrett no longer sought to flee. His war was now one of memory and morale. "Every man here," he told them, "is one play away from madness. Keep the game alive and you keep the man alive." Then came the transfer orders. In August 1944, as the front collapsed and the Allies pushed toward France, the Germans began evacuating select prisoners to deeper territory. Rumors spread. The Russians were advancing from the east, the Americans bombing Berlin, the war nearing its crescendo. Keller grew paranoid, suspecting spies among the POWs. He ordered the destruction of the pitch, the field to be plowed over and fenced off permanently. Barrett watched as trucks arrived, dumping gravel and wire where the goalposts once stood. It was like watching a grave being filled, but he refused to yield to despair. "They can bury the field," he whispered to Grant, "but they can't bury what we made of it." That night, as rain swept across the camp, Barrett crept to the fence and buried something of his own. A small tin box containing Evans's compass, Harker's ration tin, and a scrap of the football's leather. He marked the spot with a single stone. "For whoever finds this," he said quietly, "remember that men once fought here with nothing but hope." The war's tide turned violently that autumn. Allied bombers roared overhead, their engines shaking the camp windows. Keller's temper frayed as resources dwindled. The guards grew restless, hungry, afraid. Yet even as chaos crept closer, the spirit inside the wire refused to die. On October 15, 1944, the men organized one final match, an unsanctioned game played in defiance of Keller's orders. Word spread quietly through the barracks, the game that would not die. Every prisoner who could walk turned out, lining the edges of the field. Some used helmets as goal markers, others stood watch for patrols. When Barrett blew the whistle, a roar erupted, not of victory, but of existence. The ball moved through the mud like a living thing, and for 1 hour, war itself seemed to pause. Guards shouted for them to stop. One even fired into the air. No one moved. The echo of that gunshot hung in the air, and then, almost impossibly, one of the guards, young Reinhardt, tossed his rifle aside and shouted, "Play on!" The game continued until darkness swallowed the camp. Later that night, Keller stormed into the yard, livid. "You think this is courage?" he barked. "You think this makes you free?" Barrett faced him, mud still streaked on his cheeks. "It reminds us we are." Keller stared at him, trembling with rage, and something else, something that might have been envy. He turned and walked away. That was the last time the prisoners ever saw him. Within weeks, the camp was evacuated, its inmates forced on death marches westward as the Soviet front closed in. Barrett and his men trudged through the snow once more, but this time as ghosts of their own making, carrying with them the memory of the pitch, the game that had fooled watchtowers and defied despair. Months later, when the war ended and the prisoners were liberated by Allied troops, Barrett returned to what was left of Stalag Luft III. The camp was in ruins. Barracks burned, fences rusted, the field overgrown. He walked to the southern edge, past the skeletal remains of the goalposts, until he found the stone he had left buried months before. Beneath it, the tin box still waited. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside, the compass was tarnished, the leather fragments stiff with age. He held them for a long moment, then looked out across the field. "You did it, Pip," he whispered. "You too, Harker. We all did." He left the box open on the grass, its contents glinting faintly in the morning light. Not a monument, not a grave, but a message. Somewhere far beyond the ruins, a whistle blew. Not real, perhaps, but memory echoing across time. The game was over. Yet in that place, on that field of mud and courage, it would never die. The road out of Stalag Luft III was a graveyard of footprints. The snow, trampled by thousands of prisoners and guards alike, bore witness to one of the cruelest winters of the war. It was January 1945, and the Red Army was closing in from the east. In the dead of night, the Germans had sounded the alarm, Evakuierung, forcing over 10,000 POWs to march westward through snowdrifts that reached the knees. Flight Lieutenant Tom Barrett walked among them, his breath ragged in the frozen air, the memories of the tunnel and the field haunting every step. Around him, men stumbled and fell, their bodies broken by hunger and frostbite. Guards barked orders, their own faces pale with fear. They knew as well as the prisoners that the war was lost, that the Reich was collapsing from within. Yet none of that mattered now. What mattered was survival, one step, then another, through the endless white void. The sound of boots on snow became hypnotic, a rhythm both mechanical and human. Barrett held that rhythm close, the way he once held the cadence of the game, of the whistle, of the pitch where they had stolen defiance from despair. It was his heartbeat now, carrying him through the cold toward a horizon that promised nothing but the unknown. Days turned into a blur of exhaustion and hunger. The column wound through abandoned villages and burning forests, past frozen rivers where tanks lay half-submerged in ice. The sky itself seemed gray with ash. Barrett shared his rations and a few crumbs of black bread with Sam Grant, whose lips had turned blue from the cold. "Keep moving," Barrett whispered each night as they huddled beneath barns or against walls. "If we stop, we die." Around them, men disappeared into the snow one by one, their bodies left behind to freeze where they fell. By the time they reached Münsterberg, less than half remained. Yet somehow Barrett's small group, Grant, Evans, Harker, and a handful of others, endured. Evans, now thinner than a scarecrow, walked with a limp from the frostbite he'd suffered after his failed escape. Still, his eyes burned with that same miner's fire. "We dug our way out once," he said through cracked lips. "We can walk our way out again." Barrett smiled faintly. "That's the spirit, Pip. Just remember which way's up this time." As the march dragged westward, whispers spread among the prisoners that the Americans were closing in from the Rhine, that Hitler's empire was crumbling. They passed columns of refugees, carts piled with children and old men, the roads littered with wreckage and despair. The guards grew jumpy, firing at shadows, drinking from flasks to keep warm. The POWs no longer looked like captives. They looked like survivors of a storm that had swallowed the world. In the distance, artillery rumbled like distant thunder, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and spring. A cruel hint that life still existed somewhere beyond this march of ghosts. By March 1945, the column reached Moosburg, where the Germans herded them into a sprawling camp already packed with thousands of Allied soldiers, Stalag LUFT. It was a city of mud and misery, stretching as far as the eye could see. Barrett and his men collapsed into a corner of a wooden barrack, too weak to eat. Outside, the guards shouted, the sound of chaos growing louder each day. "They're losing control," Grant murmured. "You can feel it." Barrett nodded, staring through a crack in the wall at the guard towers. The floodlights still swept the camp, but their rhythm was lazy now, uncertain. "When those lights go dark," Barrett said, "we run." Evans looked up, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Run where?" Barrett smiled faintly. "Anywhere they're not." The end came not with a shout, but with a distant rumble that grew into a roar. On the morning of April 29, 1945, the men of Stalag LUFT awoke to the thunder of engines and the crack of gunfire. The guards were in chaos, some fleeing, others shouting orders no one followed. Barrett pushed himself to the window just as a column of American Sherman tanks burst through the camp's outer fence. The stars and stripes fluttered in the smoke. "It's over," someone whispered. Then the cheering began, weak at first, then rising, rolling through the camp like a wave breaking after 6 years of storm. Men climbed onto the roofs of barracks, waving rags, helmets, anything that could serve as a flag. Barrett felt tears freeze on his cheeks. He turned to Evans, who was laughing through his exhaustion. "Told you we'd win the match," Evans said. Barrett's voice broke. "Aye, and this time we're not giving the field back." The liberation was chaos wrapped in euphoria. The Americans stormed the camp, rounding up the remaining guards, distributing rations, and shouting through bullhorns. "You're free, boys. You're free." For many, the words didn't register. Freedom was too big, too distant a thing to fit inside the hollow shell of hunger and grief. Barrett watched as men fell to their knees in the mud, some praying, others laughing hysterically. Grant, ever the joker, tried to light a cigarette and dropped it twice before managing a puff. "So this is freedom," he said, coughing. Barrett smiled, though his eyes were elsewhere, on the horizon where smoke from the battle still hung over the fields. "It's a start." Days later, the survivors were gathered for transport. Trucks rolled through the gates that had once confined them, carrying the men toward staging camps where they'd be fed, deloused, and sent home. Barrett sat in the back of one truck wrapped in a blanket, staring at the passing countryside. The forest, the rivers, the villages, all the same places that had once trapped them now unfolded like a moving photograph of memory. Evans sat beside him, silent, holding a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "What's that?" Barrett asked. Evans smiled faintly. "Something I picked up before we left." He unwrapped it, revealing the compass, the same one buried months ago beneath the field. "Found it still there when the Yanks came through Sagan," he said. "Figured it deserved another trip." Barrett took it, turning it in his hands. The needle still moved, steady as ever, pointing north. "Still works," he murmured. Evans nodded. Always did. When Barrett finally returned to England, the war was already ending. London was gray with victory, its streets filled with laughter and ghosts. He was greeted with handshakes, medals, and polite questions about the camp, but he rarely spoke of it. He returned instead to quiet life in Yorkshire, where he taught engineering to young men too young to remember the sound of sirens. Sometimes on Sundays he'd walk to the village green and watch the local boys play football. The thud of boots, the laughter, the sharp blow of the whistle carrying through the air. Once a boy asked him to referee. He smiled and took the whistle, feeling its weight between his fingers. When he blew it, the sound was sharp, clear, alive, and in that instant the years fell away. The barracks, the tunnel, the guards, the snow, all of it returning in the echo. In 1949, Barrett was invited to a reunion of former POWs in London. The hall was filled with faces he recognized, older now but lit with the same quiet fire. Evans was there too, walking with a cane, his grin undimmed. "You hear?" he said, clapping Barrett on the shoulder. "They're rebuilding the campsite, turning it into a memorial." Barrett's breath caught. "The field?" Evans nodded. "The very one. They found your tin box when they cleared the ground." Barrett said nothing for a long moment, then smiled. "Then I suppose the game never ended." Later that night, the two men stood by the window overlooking the Thames, their reflections caught in the glass. "Do you ever miss it?" Evans asked softly. Barrett thought for a moment. "Not the wire," he said. "Not the hunger. But the man? The sound of the whistle? Every day, years passed. The world moved on. Stalag Luft III became history, its ruins preserved under pine trees in what was now Poland. Tourists came to see the tunnels, the barracks, the field that once hid rebellion. And somewhere in the museum's quiet beneath glass sat a small leather football and a rusted compass, artifacts of defiance. A plaque beside them read, "They played to survive. They dug to be free." Every year on the anniversary of the escape attempt, a memorial match was held on a reconstructed field. Veterans came in wheelchairs wearing medals over worn coats, watching as children played under the open sky. The ball rolled, the laughter rose, and for a moment it was 1944 again, the sound of hope echoing beyond the wire.